The autumn of 1891 brought with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate the very bones of London. From our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, I could observe the fog rolling in from the Thames like some primordial beast, devouring the city's familiar landmarks with an insatiable hunger. It was on such a morning, grey and oppressive, that Mrs. Hudson delivered what would prove to be one of the most disturbing cases of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes sat hunched over his chemical apparatus, absorbed in some experiment that had been occupying his attention for the better part of 3 days. The acrid smell of burning sulphur mingled with the tobacco smoke that perpetually wreathed our sitting room, creating an atmosphere that would have driven most men to distraction. Yet I had grown accustomed to these eccentricities, finding in them a strange comfort that spoke to the ordered chaos of my friend's brilliant mind. "A letter for Mr. Holmes," announced Mrs. Hudson, her voice carrying that particular note of disapproval reserved for correspondence that arrived at ungodly hours. Delivered by a most agitated young woman not 10 minutes past. She would not give her name, but insisted it was a matter of utmost urgency. Holmes looked up from his retorts and beakers, his keen grey eyes immediately focusing with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Indeed? The handwriting, Watson. Observe the handwriting." I examined the envelope as Mrs. Hudson departed with a meaningful sniff. The address was written in a hasty, feminine hand, the ink blotted in several places, as though the writer had been trembling. Most tellingly, there were what appeared to be water stains, or tears, dotting the paper. "The correspondent is female, obviously distressed, and writing under considerable emotional duress," Holmes observed, setting aside his apparatus with the careful precision that marked all his movements. "Note how the letters grow increasingly erratic, toward the end of each line suggesting fatigue or fear. The paper is of decent quality, indicating education and at least modest means, yet the urgency of delivery suggests someone acting outside normal social conventions." With practiced efficiency, Holmes slit open the envelope and extracted 2 sheets of paper. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave, the sharp planes of his face settling into that mask of concentration I knew so well. After several minutes, he looked up. "Watson, cancel any appointments you may have for the next several days. We are about to embark upon a case that promises to challenge even our most deeply held assumptions about the nature of madness and sanity." He handed me the letter, and I read with growing horror. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you in the greatest desperation, for I fear that no one else will believe what I have witnessed. My name is Miss Catherine Hartwell, and I am employed as a nurse at Greystone Asylum, some 15 miles northeast of London. 3 days ago, our chief administrator, Dr. Erasmus Wenton, was found dead in his locked office under circumstances the police have declared suicide. But Mr. Holmes, I know this cannot be true, for reasons I dare not commit to paper lest this letter fall into the wrong hands. More troubling still is the disappearance of a patient, a man known to us only as Thomas Gray, who vanished from his cell the very night of Dr. Wenton's death. The official records show no patient by this name has ever been admitted to our facility, yet I have attended to him personally for the past 6 months. When I inquired about him, I was told I was mistaken, that no such patient ever existed. Mr. Holmes, I have enclosed a page that I managed to retrieve from Dr. Wenton's office before the police arrived. It was lying beside his body, stained with blood, and appears to have been torn from our patient ledger. You will see that it bears an entry for the very man they claim never existed. I fear for my safety, Mr. Holmes, and for the safety of the remaining patients. There are whispers among the staff of experiments being conducted after hours, of patients who enter certain wards and are never seen again. Dr. Wenton discovered something. I am certain of it, and now he is dead. Please, I beg of you, come to Greystone before it is too late. I will find a way to meet with you, but we must be careful. The walls have ears in this dreadful place, and I fear that death may be the least of the horrors that await those who ask too many questions. Your desperate correspondent, Miss C. Hartwell." I set down the letter with hands that trembled slightly. Good God, Holmes, if this woman speaks the truth, then we are dealing with something far more sinister than a simple suicide, Holmes finished, examining the second sheet of paper with his magnifying glass. "This, Watson, is the blood-stained page she mentions. Observe. The paper was indeed stained with what appeared to be dried blood, the rusty brown marks obscuring portions of the text. But what remained visible was deeply disturbing. Written in a precise clinical hand were the details of a patient admission. Thomas Gray, admitted 15th March 1891, age approximately 35 years. Condition, acute melancholia. Following industrial accident treatment. Dr. Mordaunt's experimental procedures. Notes, patient shows unusual resistance to standard treatments. Dr. M requests special authorization for advanced methodologies. Below this, in different handwriting, shakier, more urgent, were additional notes that made my blood run cold. They are killing them. God help me, they are killing them all. The serum, it doesn't cure, it destroys. Must document everything before. The entry ended abruptly, the final words trailing off into an illegible scrawl. Curious, Holmes murmured, his voice taking on that particular tone that indicated his mind was already racing ahead to connections I could not yet perceive. The official records show no Thomas Gray, yet here we have documentary evidence of his admission. Either someone has gone to considerable trouble to erase this man from existence posthumously, or what, Holmes? Or Thomas Gray was never meant to exist officially in the first place, which raises the rather disturbing question of who he actually was and why his presence at Greystone required such secrecy. Holmes rose from his chair and began pacing the room with that restless energy that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. Consider the facts as presented, Watson. Dr. Wenton is found dead in a locked room, apparently by his own hand. Simultaneously, a patient who officially doesn't exist vanishes without a trace. A nurse risks her career, possibly her life, to contact us, claiming knowledge of illegal experiments. And we have documentary evidence that someone at Greystone has been conducting unauthorized medical procedures. It certainly suggests conspiracy rather than suicide, I agreed. More than that, Watson, it suggests that Greystone Asylum is not what it appears to be. Mental institutions have always been places where society's unwanted can disappear without question, but this goes beyond mere neglect. Someone has been using the asylum as a cover for activities that required the complete erasure of certain individuals from all official records. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his eyes blazing with that fierce intelligence that had solved so many seemingly impossible mysteries. We must visit Greystone immediately, but we cannot arrive as ourselves. The very fact that Miss Hartwell felt compelled to write to us suggests that conventional authorities have either been deceived or compromised. We will need to adopt disguises and approach the matter with extreme caution. What did you have in mind? I shall pose as Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in alienism from Edinburgh, come to observe Greystone's acclaimed treatment methods. You will accompany me as my colleague and note-taker. The medical community is small enough that complete deception would be impossible, but large enough that two visiting doctors might pass unnoticed long enough to gather the evidence we need. As Holmes outlined his plan, I found myself studying the blood-stained page with growing unease. The handwriting in those final, desperate notes bore the unmistakable character of a man who knew he was about to die, a man who had discovered something so terrible that it had cost him his life. Holmes, I said quietly, what if we're walking into the same trap that killed Dr. Wenton? My friend's smile was sharp as a blade. Then we shall ensure that we are considerably better prepared than poor Dr. Wenton appears to have been. But first, we must gather what intelligence we can about Greystone and its staff. Holmes moved to his filing system, a chaos of newspaper clippings, police reports, and correspondence that somehow formed a perfect archive in his remarkable memory. Within minutes he had assembled a small stack of materials. Greystone Asylum, he began, reading from what appeared to be a medical journal, established in 1867 by the late Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, pioneer in the treatment of severe mental disorders. Upon his death in 1885, the facility came under the administration of Dr. Erasmus Wenton and Dr. Silas Mordaunt. The asylum is privately funded and caters primarily to patients whose families prefer discretion to conventional treatment. Doctor, I observed, the same name mentioned in the patient notes. Indeed, according to this profile, Dr. Mordaunt studied under some rather controversial figures in Vienna and Berlin, physicians known for their progressive approaches to mental illness, the kind of men whose methods occasionally attracted the attention of medical boards and, in some cases, criminal investigators. Holmes set aside the journal and picked up what appeared to be a police report. Most interesting of all, Watson, is this small item from the Yard's files. In the past 18 months, there have been 7 reports of missing persons whose last known whereabouts placed them in the vicinity of Greystone Asylum. In each case, the investigation concluded that the individuals had simply chosen to disappear, troubled souls seeking escape from their circumstances. 7 missing persons, 7 that we know of. How many others might have vanished without anyone to report their absence? The homeless, the friendless, those estranged from their families. Society's invisible population. The implications were staggering. If Holmes's suspicions were correct, we were not dealing with a single murder, but with a systematic program of elimination that had been operating under the cover of medical treatment. There's something else, Holmes continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. According to Miss Hartwell's letter, Thomas Gray was known to her for 6 months, but his admission date on this ledger page is March 15th, barely 7 weeks ago. Either our correspondent is mistaken about the duration of her acquaintance with this patient, or the ledger has been altered, I finished. Precisely, which suggests that someone has been very busy covering their tracks in the wake of Dr. Wenton's death. The question is whether they have been entirely successful. Holmes moved to the window and stood gazing out at the fog-shrouded street. We leave for Greystone this afternoon, Watson. I suggest you pack your medical bag. We may have need of your professional skills before this business is concluded. As I prepared for our journey, my mind kept returning to Miss Hartwell's letter and the desperation evident in every line. Somewhere in that grim institution, a young woman was risking everything to expose a truth that had already cost one man his life. The thought of what we might find there filled me with a dread that all my years of military service and association with Holmes had not entirely inured me to. The fog was thickening as we departed Baker Street, swallowing the familiar landmarks of London in its grey embrace. As our hansom cab rattled through the empty streets toward the railway station, I could not shake the feeling that we were leaving behind not merely the city, but civilization itself, venturing into a realm where the normal rules of human behavior had been suspended in service of some unimaginable purpose. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the gas lamps that pierced the gloom like wan sentinels. I knew that behind those penetrating grey eyes, his remarkable mind was already at work, analyzing and categorizing every detail of the case, searching for the threads that would eventually unravel the truth. But as our cab disappeared into the fog-bound maze of London's outer districts, heading toward whatever horrors awaited us at Greystone Asylum, I could not help but wonder if this time even Sherlock Holmes might have met his match. The train journey to Greystone Station consumed the better part of 3 hours, carrying us through increasingly desolate countryside as London's sprawl gave way to marshland and moor. Holmes had spent the time in characteristic fashion, alternately smoking his pipe in contemplative silence and making rapid notes in his pocketbook. I occupied myself reviewing medical literature on alienism, preparing for our assumed roles as visiting specialists. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured as our destination came into view, "how the architects of Greystone chose their location. Through the grimy window of our compartment, I could see the asylum rising from the surrounding marshes like some Gothic monstrosity born of fever dreams. The building itself was a massive structure of grey stone, its towers and battlements suggesting a medieval fortress rather than a medical facility. More telling still was its isolation, surrounded on all sides by treacherous bogland that would make escape nearly impossible for patients, and approach difficult for anyone seeking to investigate its operations. A perfect prison disguised as a hospital, I observed. More than that, Watson. It's a place where people can disappear without a trace, where screams might be mistaken for the cries of the genuinely mad, and where the boundary between treatment and torture becomes dangerously blurred. The station at Greystone was little more than a wooden platform, attended by a single elderly porter, who regarded us with the suspicious eyes of one unaccustomed to visitors. Our luggage, consisting of medical bags and the leather satchel containing Holmes's disguise materials, seemed to intrigue him considerably. "You gentlemen be going up to the asylum?" he inquired, his voice carrying the thick accent of the local dialect. "Indeed," Holmes replied in the educated tones of Dr. James Morrison. "I am here at the invitation of Dr. Mordaunt to observe their innovative treatment methods." The porter's expression grew markedly more guarded. "Aye, well, there's been a bit of upset there recently. Dr. Wenton passing on and all. Terrible business, that. Quite tragic, Holmes agreed. I understand he took his own life. So they say, the porter replied, but his tone suggested considerable skepticism. Though I've known Erasmus Wenton since he were a lad, and he weren't the sort to do himself harm. Too much pride, if you ask me. This unsolicited character assessment proved most illuminating, suggesting that local opinion differed significantly from the official verdict. Holmes filed the information away with that perfect recall that made him such a formidable investigator. Our journey to the asylum itself was accomplished via an ancient dog cart driven by a taciturn individual who identified himself only as Jakes. The road, if it could be dignified with such a term, wound through increasingly treacherous terrain, with pools of stagnant water reflecting the leaden sky and twisted trees that seemed to claw at the grey heavens like arthritic fingers. As we approached the main gates of Greystone, I was struck by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the place. High walls topped with iron spikes surrounded the grounds, and the gatehouse was manned by guards whose bearing suggested military rather than medical training. "State your business," demanded the senior guard, a bull-necked individual whose uniform strained across his considerable girth. "Dr. James Morrison and Dr. Watson," Holmes replied smoothly, producing forged credentials that bore an Edinburgh address. "We are expected by Dr. Mordaunt." The guard examined our papers with the painful deliberation of one unaccustomed to reading. After several minutes he grudgingly admitted us, though not without recording our names in a ledger that he kept locked within his guardhouse. The main building of Greystone loomed before us like something from a Gothic romance, its windows dark and uninviting despite the afternoon hour. As we approached the main entrance, I became aware of sounds emanating from within. Not the ordinary bustle of a medical facility, but something more disturbing. Occasional cries echoed from the upper floors, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps and slamming doors. "Gentlemen, welcome to Greystone." The voice belonged to a tall, cadaverous individual who emerged from the shadows of the entrance hall like some Victorian undertaker. His pale skin seemed almost translucent in the dim light, and his dark eyes held an intensity that bordered on fanatical. "I am Dr. Silas Mordaunt," he continued, extending a hand that felt uncomfortably cold even through my gloves. "I trust your journey was not too arduous." Holmes, maintaining his role as Dr. Morrison, responded with appropriate professional courtesy. "Not at all, Dr. Mordaunt, though I confess the recent tragedy here has cast something of a shadow over our visit. My condolences on the loss of Dr. Wenton." A fleeting expression crossed Mordaunt's face, too quick to interpret, but suggesting emotions more complex than simple grief. "Yes, poor Erasmus. A brilliant administrator, but I fear the pressures of our work here proved too much for his constitution. Mental illness is a demanding field, as I'm sure you gentlemen understand." As we followed Mordaunt through the asylum's corridors, I made careful note of our surroundings. The interior of Greystone was as forbidding as its exterior, with narrow passages lit by gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I preferred not to identify. "Our patient population currently numbers 43 individuals," Mordaunt was explaining as we walked. "We specialize in the treatment of severe disorders, cases that conventional asylums have declared hopeless. Our methods, while sometimes controversial, have achieved remarkable results." "What sort of methods?" Holmes inquired with professional interest. Mordaunt's smile was thin and cold. "Hydrotherapy, of course, electrical stimulation, chemical interventions based on the latest continental research. We are particularly interested in the relationship between physical trauma and mental disturbance, the notion that certain psychological conditions might be cured through carefully controlled physiological shock." The implications of this statement sent a chill down my spine. In the hands of an unscrupulous practitioner, such controlled shock could easily become systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. "Fascinating," Holmes replied neutrally. "I should very much like to observe these procedures in action." "Tomorrow, perhaps," Mordaunt said. "Tonight I fear our schedule is rather full. But come, let me show you to your accommodations. We maintain a small guest wing for visiting colleagues." Our rooms proved to be Spartan but comfortable, located in what appeared to be a newer section of the building. As Mordaunt departed with promises to continue our tour in the morning, Holmes immediately began a careful examination of our quarters. "The walls are remarkably thick," he observed, tapping various surfaces with his knuckles. "Sound would not carry easily from these rooms, an ideal location for guests who might witness something they were not intended to see. Do you think we've been detected? Certainly our arrival has been noted and recorded. The question is whether our assumed identities will withstand scrutiny." Holmes moved to the window and peered out at the asylum grounds. "Watson, do you see that building there? The one with the barred windows and separate entrance?" I joined him at the window. In the gathering dusk, I could make out a low structure connected to the main building by a covered walkway. Unlike the rest of the asylum, this building showed signs of recent construction and was surrounded by additional security measures. "That, I believe, is where Dr. Mordaunt conducts his most innovative treatments," Holmes continued. "Note how it can be accessed without passing through the main patient areas, and observe the chimney. It suggests the presence of furnaces or incinerators." The implication was clear and horrifying. "Good God, Holmes. You think they're disposing of bodies?" "I think they're disposing of evidence," he replied grimly. "The question is what form that evidence takes." As if summoned by our conversation, a figure appeared at one of the barred windows of the mysterious building. For a moment, a pale face was visible in the dim light. A woman's face, I thought, though at this distance it was difficult to be certain. Then the figure was gone, leaving only darkness behind the bars. "We must find a way to contact Miss Hartwell," Holmes said. "If she is still alive, she may be our only reliable source of information about what truly transpires within these walls." Our opportunity came sooner than expected. A soft knock at our door announced the arrival of a young woman carrying a tea service. She was plainly dressed in the uniform of an asylum attendant, her auburn hair severely pinned beneath a white cap. But her eyes held an intelligence and intensity that immediately set her apart from the other staff we had encountered. "Tea for the visiting doctors," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes met Holmes's with unmistakable significance. "Thank you, miss," Holmes began. "Hartwell," she replied, her voice now barely audible. "Miss Catherine Hartwell." The relief I felt at finding our correspondent alive and apparently unharmed was immediately tempered by the fear evident in her every gesture. As she arranged the tea service, she managed to slip Holmes a small folded paper without appearing to do so. "The evening medication rounds begin at 9 o'clock, she said in normal tones, clearly for the benefit of any listeners. "Lights out is at 10. If you gentlemen require anything during the night, please ring the bell." With that, she departed as quietly as she had come, leaving us with our tea and the small paper that might contain vital intelligence about the horrors of Greystone. Holmes unfolded the note carefully. Written in the same urgent hand as her original letter were instructions that made my blood run cold. "Meet me in the East Wing basement at midnight. Take the servants' stairs beside the kitchen. Beware, guards patrol every hour. Thomas Gray is not the only patient who has vanished. They are planning something terrible for tomorrow night. Trust no one but each other. C.H." "Tomorrow night," Holmes mused. What could be significant about tomorrow night? I consulted my pocket calendar. October 31st, All Hallows' Eve. "How appropriate," Holmes said with grim humor. "A night when the boundary between the living and the dead becomes permeable, at least in popular superstition. I suspect Dr. Mordaunt may be planning to make that superstition a reality for some of his patients." The hours until midnight passed with agonizing slowness. Holmes spent the time examining every inch of our quarters, discovering several interesting features, including what appeared to be listening devices concealed within the walls. I occupied myself with medical journals, trying to familiarize myself with the latest theories on mental illness, while simultaneously preparing for whatever horrors we might encounter. At precisely midnight, we made our way through the darkened corridors of Greystone toward the rendezvous with Miss Hartwell. The asylum at night was a place of whispers and shadows, with occasional distant cries that might have come from patients or might have been something else entirely. Our footsteps, muffled by careful placement, seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The basement of the East Wing was a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces, lit only by the dim glow of widely spaced gas jets. We found Miss Hartwell waiting in what appeared to be a disused laundry room, her face pale but determined in the wan light. "Thank God you came," she whispered. "I was beginning to fear that my letter had gone astray." "We received it, Miss Hartwell," Holmes replied quietly. "Now tell us everything you know about Thomas Gray and Dr. Wenton's death." She nodded, gathering her composure before beginning her tale. "Thomas Gray was brought here 6 months ago, though the official records show only the recent entry you've seen. He was different from our other patients, coherent, intelligent, frightened, rather than mad. He claimed to have been a journalist investigating irregularities in the treatment of pauper lunatics in London." "A journalist," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "That would explain the official erasure of his records. Someone wanted his investigation terminated permanently. He told me he had discovered a network of private asylums that were accepting payments to dispose of inconvenient individuals, people whose families wanted them permanently removed, creditors seeking to eliminate debtors, even government agents silencing potential witnesses to official misconduct. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. And Dr. Wenton discovered this? More than that. He found evidence that Dr. Mordaunt was not merely accepting such commissions, but actively soliciting them. The asylum was generating enormous revenues from these illegal disposals, with the victims listed as suicides or deaths from natural causes." Holmes leaned forward intently. "What changed? Why did Dr. Wenton suddenly decide to expose this operation?" Miss Hartwell's voice dropped to barely audible levels. "They brought in a child, Mr. Holmes, a girl of perhaps 12 years, whose guardian wanted her inheritance. Dr. Wenton drew the line at murdering children, but Dr. Mordaunt refused to return the money that had already been paid. Where is this child now?" "Dead," she replied, tears streaming down her face. "They made it appear to be brain fever, but I know better. And Dr. Wenton knew better too. He confronted Dr. Mordaunt 3 days ago, threatening to expose everything to the authorities. That night, he was found dead in his locked office, locked from the inside. So it appeared. But I saw Dr. Mordaunt leaving the administrative wing at nearly midnight, carrying what looked like medical equipment. When I went to investigate, I found Dr. Wenton's body and that blood-stained page from the ledger." Holmes considered this information carefully. "The locked room presents certain technical challenges, but they are not insurmountable for someone with medical knowledge and access to appropriate drugs. A paralytic agent administered while the victim was still conscious would create the appearance of suicide while ensuring he could not resist or call for help." "There's more," Miss Hartwell continued. Tonight, Dr. Mordaunt is expecting a large group of new patients, but they're not being brought here for treatment. They're being brought here for disposal. The preparations have been going on for weeks." "How many?" "At least a dozen, possibly more. Men and women whose disappearance will either go unnoticed or be explained as voluntary departures from society." Holmes stood abruptly, his face grim in the gaslight. "Then we must act immediately. Watson, how long would it take you to prepare a message to Inspector Lestrade?" "Holmes," I protested, "even if we could get a message out tonight, the Yard couldn't organize a response in time to prevent this massacre." "Then we shall have to prevent it ourselves," he replied with that calm determination that had carried us through so many dangerous situations. "Miss Hartwell, is there a way to access the building where these procedures are conducted?" "The laboratory building?" "Yes, but it's heavily guarded. Dr. Mordaunt has hired men from London. Criminals, I think, rather than medical attendants." "Criminals would be more reliable for this sort of work," Holmes observed. "Medical men might retain inconvenient scruples about mass murder." A distant sound echoed through the basement, footsteps on stone growing gradually closer. Miss Hartwell's eyes widened with terror. "Someone's coming," she whispered. "If they find us here." Holmes moved swiftly to extinguish the nearest gas jet, plunging our corner of the basement into deeper shadow. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by voices, at least 2 men speaking in low tones that suggested urgency rather than routine patrol. "Told you the Scottish doctors were trouble," one voice was saying. "Dr. Mordaunt wants them watched closely." "What about the nurse?" asked a second voice, rougher than the first. "She's been asking too many questions. She'll be taken care of tomorrow night with the rest of them. One more won't make any difference." The voices began to fade as the speakers moved past our hiding place, but their words had confirmed our worst fears. Not only was a mass killing planned for the following evening, but we ourselves were now under suspicion, and Miss Hartwell had been marked for elimination. After the footsteps had completely faded, Holmes stepped back into the dim light. "Miss Hartwell, you are in immediate danger. Is there somewhere you can hide until this business is concluded?" "There's an old wine cellar beneath the kitchens," she replied. "It's been abandoned for years, but it's dry and has a separate entrance. I could hide there if necessary." "Do so immediately," Holmes instructed. "Gather whatever evidence you can, documents, patient records, anything that might prove useful in court. We'll create a distraction that should allow you to reach safety." "What sort of distraction?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Holmes smiled grimly. "We're going to pay an unscheduled visit to Dr. Mordaunt's laboratory. If we can document what's happening there, we'll have evidence sufficient to bring down this entire operation." As we prepared to part ways, Miss Hartwell grasped Holmes's arm with desperate intensity. "Mr. Holmes, there's something else you should know. The patients who are brought here for disposal, they don't all die immediately. Some are used for experiments first. Dr. Mordaunt has been testing various compounds and procedures using human subjects who have no legal protection." "What sort of experiments?" "Chemical agents that affect the mind and nervous system, surgical procedures that leave the subjects alive but permanently altered. He's been documenting everything meticulously, as though he plans to publish his findings." The full horror of Greystone was finally becoming clear. We were dealing not merely with a murder-for-hire operation, but with a systematic program of human experimentation that would have horrified even the most callous members of the medical profession. As Miss Hartwell disappeared into the shadows, heading for her hiding place, Holmes and I began our own careful ascent toward the main floor of the asylum. Somewhere above us, Dr. Mordaunt and his associates were preparing for a night of unspeakable horror, confident that their activities would remain forever hidden within the walls of Greystone. But they had not counted on the intervention of Sherlock Holmes, and that oversight would prove to be their undoing. The laboratory building proved to be even more sinister than its external appearance had suggested. Holmes had discovered a maintenance tunnel that connected the basements of the two structures, allowing us to approach undetected through the bowels of the earth. As we emerged into what had once been a coal cellar, the sounds from above painted a picture of frenetic activity. Multiple footsteps, the rolling of wheeled apparatus, and occasionally the muffled protests of human voices. "They're already beginning," Holmes whispered, consulting his pocket watch. "It's nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Whatever timeline they're following, we may already be too late for some of the intended victims." We crept up a narrow service stairway that emerged behind a bank of steam boilers. The mechanical noise provided excellent cover for our movements, but also made it impossible to determine the exact number of people in the building above. Through gaps in the floorboards, we could see the flickering shadows cast by gas lamps and occasionally catch fragments of conversation. The new batch from Whitechapel should provide excellent subjects for the nerve agent trials, a voice was saying. Dr. Mordaunt unmistakably. "What about the Scottish doctors?" This was a rougher voice, one of the hired criminals we had heard earlier. "They've served their purpose," Mordaunt replied, with chilling indifference. "Their presence here will provide the perfect explanation for tonight's regrettable accident. A gas leak, perhaps, or a fire in the old wing. So tragic when visiting colleagues perish, while trying to help patients escape." Holmes's expression in the dim light was murderous. We were not merely witnesses to this atrocity, we were intended to become its victims, our deaths used to cover the elimination of a dozen or more innocent people. "Watson," Holmes breathed directly into my ear, "I need you to return through the tunnel and raise the alarm. Get word to the local constabulary, to Inspector Lestrade, to anyone who will listen. This ends tonight." "I won't leave you here alone, Holmes." "You must. If we both perish, there will be no one to tell the world what happened here. Go and take this with you." He pressed something into my hand, a small camera of the type used by police photographers, compact enough to be concealed within his coat. "I've been documenting everything we've seen. If I don't survive to testify, at least the evidence will." Before I could protest further, Holmes had melted back into the shadows, moving with that silent grace that had served him so well in countless dangerous situations. I knew better than to argue with his logic, but leaving him felt like the worst betrayal of our long partnership. The journey back through the tunnel seemed to take hours, though my watch showed barely 15 minutes had passed. When I finally emerged into the night air through a concealed exit near the asylum's boundary wall, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing a sky heavy with storm clouds. In the distance, I could see lights burning in what I took to be the local constable's house. Constable Jameson proved to be a solid, practical man who listened to my story with growing alarm. Within minutes he had roused 2 deputies and dispatched riders to the nearest towns with telegraph connections. By dawn, I assured him, Inspector Lestrade and a full squad of Metropolitan Police would be converging on Greystone. "But what about your friend?" Jameson asked as we prepared to return to the asylum. "If half of what you've told me is true, he's in mortal danger." "Holmes has survived worse odds than these," I replied, though privately I feared for his safety. "Our priority must be preventing the murder of innocent people." When we reached Greystone, however, we found the situation had changed dramatically. Smoke was rising from the laboratory building, and figures could be seen moving frantically through the main courtyard. Our approach was detected immediately by guards who seemed unusually alert for the early morning hour. "There's been a terrible accident," Dr. Mordaunt announced as we were escorted into the main building. "A fire in the laboratory wing. I'm afraid your colleague, Dr. Morrison, was overcome by smoke while attempting to rescue patients from the affected area." The performance was smoothly delivered, but I could see the calculation behind Mordaunt's pale eyes. He was already constructing the narrative that would explain away the night's events. "Where is he now?" I demanded. "In the infirmary, I'm afraid. Unconscious but breathing. The smoke was quite thick, you understand." Constable Jameson stepped forward, his uniformed presence causing a visible stiffening among the asylum staff. "Dr. Mordaunt, I'm placing this facility under official investigation pending the arrival of inspectors from London. No one is to leave the premises." Mordaunt's mask of professional concern slipped slightly. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Constable." "What possible grounds?" "Murder for a start," Jameson replied bluntly. "The gentlemen from London have evidence that Dr. Wenton was killed, along with a considerable number of patients who were supposed to be under your care." The word evidence hit Mordaunt like a physical blow. His eyes darted immediately to me, and I saw recognition dawning. We had not been the harmless medical tourists he had assumed. "That's impossible," he blustered. "Doctor, Wenton took his own life, and as for patients, our mortality rates are well within acceptable parameters." "Then you won't object to a full examination of your records," Jameson interrupted, "including the patient ledgers and disposal documentation." What followed was perhaps the most satisfying moment in my long association with criminal investigation. Mordaunt's careful facade crumbled completely as the implications of official scrutiny became clear. Within minutes, he was babbling about coercion, claiming that the entire operation had been forced upon him by outside criminal elements. But even as we secured the main building, my primary concern remained Holmes's whereabouts. The infirmary proved to contain no unconscious detective, and a search of the laboratory building, now thoroughly doused by the asylum's fire brigade, revealed no trace of my friend. It was Constable Jameson who made the crucial discovery. "Dr. Watson," he called from the basement of the laboratory building, "you'd better come and see this." What he had found was a hidden chamber beneath the building's foundation, accessible only through a concealed entrance that had been disguised as a supporting pillar. The room beyond was a charnel house that defied description. Operating tables stained with blood, chemical apparatus that belonged in no legitimate medical facility, and along one wall, a series of cells that had clearly been used to house human subjects. But most remarkable of all was what we found in the chamber's central area. Holmes, very much alive and conscious, standing over the bound figure of Dr. Mordaunt, surrounded by several of the hired criminals, all of whom had been efficiently rendered unconscious. "Watson," Holmes said cheerfully, as though we were meeting for afternoon tea rather than in the bowels of a murder factory. "Excellent timing. I was beginning to wonder when the cavalry would arrive." "Good God, Holmes, how did you manage this?" "Elementary chemistry, my dear fellow. It turns out that Dr. Mordaunt's experimental compounds, when properly combined, create a most effective aerosol sedative. I simply introduced the mixture into the building's ventilation system and waited for the results." As the full scope of the Greystone conspiracy became clear over the following days, even I was shocked by its audacity. Dr. Mordaunt had indeed been operating a sophisticated murder-for-hire business, accepting payments to eliminate inconvenient individuals under the guise of treating mental illness. The victims ranged from inconvenient heirs and creditors to political dissidents and potential witnesses to official corruption. Thomas Gray had been exactly what Miss Hartwell claimed, a journalist whose investigation had brought him too close to the truth. His elimination had been intended to end his inquiries permanently, but Dr. Wenton's conscience had finally rebelled at the systematic murder of innocents. The locked room mystery was relatively simple, Holmes explained as we prepared to return to London. Mordaunt used a paralytic compound derived from South American plants. It leaves the victim conscious, but unable to move or speak. He administered the drug through Dr. Wenton's evening brandy, then arranged the scene to suggest suicide before the paralysis wore off. But how did he escape from the locked room? Through the chimney, Watson. Mordaunt is a thin man, and the fireplace in Wenton's office connects to a complex of flues that allow access to multiple rooms. A difficult exit, but entirely feasible for someone of his build and desperation. Miss Catherine Hartwell, who had emerged from hiding with a collection of documents that proved invaluable in the subsequent prosecutions, was granted protection by the Metropolitan Police and eventually testified at the trials that saw Mordaunt and his associates receive lengthy prison sentences. "One question remains unanswered," I said, as our train carried us back toward London. "What became of the patients who were brought to Greystone for elimination? Surely some of them survived." Holmes smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I had seen from him since this business began. "They did indeed. 12 individuals, including 3 who had been reported as suicides months ago. Mordaunt kept them alive for experimental purposes, never imagining that his scientific curiosity would prove to be his downfall." "And Thomas Gray?" "Alive and well, though considerably traumatized by his experience. He's already begun work on a series of articles that will expose the broader network of private asylums engaged in similar activities. I suspect his investigation will lead to significant reforms in how we supervise institutions claiming to treat mental illness." As London's familiar skyline emerged from the November fog, I reflected on the case that had taken us into the darkest corners of human depravity, disguised as medical science. The asylum ledger had been closed, its secrets exposed to the light of justice. But the memory of those underground chambers would haunt me for years to come. "Watson," Holmes said quietly as our hansom cab carried us through the gas-lit streets toward Baker Street, "there's something to be said for cases that end with the living rescued rather than merely the dead avenged." I could only nod in agreement. In a profession that too often brought us face to face with the worst impulses of human nature, the salvation of innocent lives provided a satisfaction that no intellectual triumph could match. Mrs. Hudson greeted our return with her usual mixture of relief and exasperation, and soon we were settled once again in our familiar sitting room with its comfortable chaos of books, papers, and chemical apparatus. The horror of Greystone seemed almost like a nightmare in these familiar surroundings, though I knew the trials and investigations that would follow would keep the case before us for months to come. "One final observation, Watson," Holmes said as he settled into his chair with his pipe. "The true horror of Greystone was not that evil men committed terrible acts, but that they did so under the protection of legitimate institutions and professional credentials. It serves as a reminder that our vigilance must extend not merely to common criminals, but to those who pervert the very systems designed to protect society's most vulnerable members." With that sobering thought, we turned our attention to the evening papers and the promise of new mysteries awaiting our investigation. The case of the asylum ledger was closed, but the work of Sherlock Holmes and the defense of justice against those who would corrupt it would continue as long as criminal minds sought to prey upon the innocent. Outside our window, London continued its eternal dance between light and shadow, civilization and savagery, while within the walls of 221B Baker Street, 2 men who had stared into the abyss and returned with their humanity intact, prepared to face whatever challenges the morning might bring. Thus concluded one of the most disturbing cases in the career of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, though its reverberations would continue to be felt throughout the medical and legal establishments for years to come. The reforms that followed Thomas Gray's published investigation saved countless lives and established new standards for the supervision of private medical institutions. As for Holmes himself, he spoke rarely of our time at Greystone, but I noticed that he followed news of asylum reform with particular attention, and on more than one occasion he accepted cases involving the mysterious disappearance of individuals last seen near private medical facilities. Some battles once fought must be fought again and again, lest the darkness that lurks in human hearts find new ways to disguise itself as healing light.